everyone, welcome to another Modern Deck Tech. Today, Izzet Giants, and yeah, this was quite a journey. So before I even get into the core discussion and all the usual format that you're used to, I'm going to talk about the origins of this idea. I first posted an idea for a Giants deck in Modern back when Kaldheim was still being spoiled. Specifically when I saw these three cards spoiled. So I saw Surtland Flinger, Calamity Bearer, and Glimpse the Cosmos. And I said, you know what? I feel like building a Teamer Giants deck. Teamer Giants, well, because there are some elements to that deck that I'll be getting to in a couple of seconds, but specifically these three cards seemed really awesome and abusable. At least I thought they were abusable in Modern. So Surtland Flinger, you know, obviously it's 5 mana, so it's a bit pricey, but its ability to deal essentially twice the damage if you sacrifice a giant when it attacks, you know, that seems abusable, especially when paired up with Calamity Bearer, which already doubles damage if it's a giant source. So let's say you're attacking with Surtland Flinger and Calamity Bearer is on the battlefield, and you sacrifice, let's say, a Primeval Titan. So you're dealing 12 times 2, so that's 24. Dealing 24 damage. So that's a spicy meatball right there. You know, being able to deal 24 damage and not even having to successfully attack seemed pretty cool to me. And then I saw Glimpse of Cosmos, and I was like, all right, this is pretty cool. So for 2 mana up front, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them, any one, into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order, so you don't lose the other 2. And then as long as you control a giant, well, you can cast this card from your graveyard once, so essentially has flashback for 1 blue, and you could do the same thing again. So for 3 mana, you're digging through 6 cards and taking 2 of them and putting them into your hand, unconditionally, so long as you own a giant, as long as you have a giant on the battlefield. So all right, I was like, awesome. I was totally down. I'm like, all right, Primeval Titan sees play in Modern, so that's got to be a thing, right? So, you know, I started playing with it. I started jingling with it. This was still while Kaldheim was being spoiled. And I just started going through iterations, obviously, over and over and over again. And it took me a while to actually get to this deck, even after Kaldheim was released. So I started playing in different Teamer iterations. Of course, I was playing Arbor Elf, you know, alongside Utopia Sprawl to help me ramp up into the more expensive creatures. And then I said, okay, well, that wasn't enough, because if Arbor Elf was bolted, well, then I, you know, kind of screwed up the whole plan. So then I played Birds of Paradise. Birds of Paradise didn't, you know, it seemed to help, but it didn't seem to solve my issues in terms of being stuck if one of my mana dorks gets killed. And then I was playing Explore and Growth Spiral and playing around with different you know, numbers of these cards, and really at the end of the day, nothing worked with Teamer. Nothing worked at all, and I just had to cut down. So I said, you know what, I'm going to cut green altogether, and I'm just going to go with Izzet. And I really tried to make Surtland Flinger work, but it just wasn't good enough. It didn't do anything when it came onto the board, and for 5 mana, that's brutal in Modern. And I just couldn't justify keeping it in the deck. So let's get to the core, 3.5 minutes in. So this is what the final core looked like, at least for this deck. Calamity Bearer, 4 of, still very important. I really like this card. I think it really makes this deck work more than anything else. So you definitely want to play 4 of these. Tectonic Giant. This was back in Theros Beyond Death, and didn't see too much play in Modern, and now it's being fooled around with. It's kind of funny how things work. So I started playing with this deck a lot, and then all of a sudden a bunch of other giant decks started popping up, which is kind of funny. But yeah, Tectonic Giant was pretty much on my radar from the beginning because, well, it actually has some pretty cool effects. You know, being able to choose between deal 3 damage to each opponent every time it attacks, or exiling the top 2 cards of your library, choosing one of them, and being able to cast them until your next turn, until the end of your next turn, seems very powerful, and it actually is. So that's pretty darn cool. It's a 3/4 body, so it doesn't die to bolt very easily. Same for Calamity Bearer. Then you have Bone Crusher Giant. Well, this is just a kind of win-win altogether. So ideally, you're casting it for 2 up front, you know, taking out a creature or just dealing damage to your opponent, and then on the subsequent turn, you're paying 3 to actually cast it, which is great. I mean, it's awesome. It wins all the way, and when it gets targeted by removal, you're also dealing 2 damage to, you know, your opponents. So, yeah, Bone Crusher Giant, 4 of. I was playing with 3 of at some point, but then 4 of was the final count for me. And then Glimpse the Cosmos. I really like this card. This card is really powerful in a deck like this, mostly because you get to cast it twice for 3 mana total. So that's really good. That's really spicy. I'm really liking this card. It kind of reminds me of Thieves' Fortune in my Rogues deck. If you haven't seen that, check out the deck text on that. That's an awesome deck I'll be getting back to eventually. But yeah, this is Thieves' Fortune for Giants. That's how I feel anyway. So Glimpse of Cosmos really pulls its weight here. Again, I think it's one of those cards that really makes this deck more feasible, because it's awesome. Being able to dig through 6 cards and taking 2 of them is great. So let's move on to the other creatures. So I tried other giants. There's a giant that I can't remember the name right now, but it reduces your giant spells by 2. It's a 3 mana giant, so you got to pay 3 already just to get it on the battlefield, and then it reduces your giant spells, and that's just too slow. I mean, I tried it. It's just too slow. I've seen other brewers, and I kind of ranted about this on Twitter. I won't get into it. I've seen other brewers included in their list, but it's just way too slow. It's not enough for turn 3. So I didn't play it. What I'm playing instead in the 3 CMC slot is Shatterskull Charger. Oh boy. So Shatterskull Charger is actually a fun card. It's great. So let's read it real quick. So it has Kicker 2, fine. Trample Haste. Great. That's awesome. If Shatterskull Charger was kicked, it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, so it becomes a 5/4. Awesome. At the beginning of your end step, if Shatterskull Charger doesn't have a +1/+1 counter on it, so if it wasn't kicked, essentially, return it to its owner's hand. Alright, so it's one of those creatures where it just kind of like goes, hits the battlefield, attacks it real quick, and it comes back to your hand, for safekeeping until the next turn. And it's worked really well for me. Early game, you're putting on some quick pressure that your opponent can't necessarily deal with, if they don't have the mana up or whatever. And then late game, you just cast it for, its kicker cost, so 5 mana, if you have nothing else to do with your mana, and it stays there as a 5/4, dealing damage, Trample Haste. And what I really like about it is that it has haste. So late game, it's not a dead draw. If you need something to win out the game, maybe there's a board stall. This reminds me of Savage Knuckleblade, where it has the ability to have haste the minute it enters the battlefield. So Shatterskull Charger is, really pulling its weight here. It's really great. I'm playing another card in this deck that I'll get to in a second that makes this even more playable. So yeah, I really liked it as a 4-of. It's great. I mean, try it out. You'll see what I mean. Then I have Glasspool Mimic. So when I cut Surtland Flinger, I didn't have enough threats. And I was trying to look for more viable giants in Izzet colors, so those are blue and red. And it really didn't make sense to go to 5+ CMC. So I needed something cheaper. And the only thing that really made this deck work even better, I find, was Glasspool Mimic. So you may have Glasspool Mimic enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature you control, except it's a shapeshifter rogue in addition to its other types. That's pretty straightforward. I mean, you could use it for its land, the flip side, but I don't really see the need for that. You almost certainly want to use this to, copy a Calamity Bearer or whatever, anything, basically, any other creature that you have in this deck. And it's great, it's your 5th, 6th, 7th of whatever creature you need. So yeah, Glasspool Mimic is a 3-of, and I really liked it here. So let's move on to the cantrip. So obviously I don't have Glimpse of Cosmos here because I already covered it, but it is a cantrip. We are playing 4 Sleight of Hands. I'm not playing Serum Visions. In a deck like this, I don't feel like I need Serum to be able to set up two draws ahead. What I really enjoyed more was playing 4 Sleight of Hands, where I just look at the top 2 cards, I pick one, and then move on. Very similar to the effect of Glimpse of Cosmos, if you think about it. So you just look at the top 2, pick one, the other one goes to the bottom of your library, you don't lose it. So yeah, 4 Sleight of Hands really, worked well in this deck. Then you have removal. Well, I mean, you have Bone Crusher Giant, which is technically removal, and you have 4 Lightning Bolt. Shocker. Alright, so I tagged this under the ramp. Don't really know what else to call it. It is kind of ramp, I guess. It's not really a tutor. Aethervile. Yeah, Aethervile. So, I mean, I dropped green, and green was really there, mostly for Primeval Titan, but also to help me ramp. But it wasn't doing what I wanted to do. And then when I was in Izzet, well, I still needed something to accelerate my creatures whenever possible. And Aethervile is that thing. It is that tool. So, I mean, listen, our cheapest creature is 3 CMC. So, even turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, this is not doing much. You're just waiting. You have other cards in this deck to kind of, slow down attacks, whatever it may be. Your sideboard can be transitional to include counter spells, if you're playing against combo decks. So Aethervile is really going to start kicking in turn 4, turn 5. But once it does start kicking in, assuming you've been drawing other creatures in the meantime and you're able to cast them, which is the odds are yes. Yeah, this starts becoming really brutal. Being able to put down 2 giants in a turn, on turn 4, is going to start getting out of hand for your opponent really quickly. They may not notice it because you're not doing anything for the first 3 turns, but once this gets to 3 counters, you can start doing some damage with Shadow Skull Charger, Bone Crusher Giant. You can start doing a bunch of things. You could cast 2 Shadow Skull Chargers in a turn on turn 4 and start dealing damage, and it'll return to your hand. You could do it again next turn, or next turn you make Aethervile tick up to 4, and then you could cast a Shadow Skull Charger and then cheat in a Calamity Bear, whatever it may be. You could do a lot of things, and I've really had a lot of fun with Aethervile. My win percentage has definitely improved quite a bit when Aethervile was on the battlefield, so this is definitely something I keep. This is not a flex spot at all. This is a mainstay of this deck. Moving on to land destruction. I mean, it's not really land destruction, it's more like land disruption, but I am playing Blood Moon. I'm playing 4 of. I don't see why I wouldn't in this kind of a deck, especially in a deck that is kind of slower. Blood Moon can come in handy here, and it really pulled its weight. There are a lot of decks in the meta right now, in the top meta, that fold really hard to Blood Moon. So having this in your main means that you can probably cheat out a win game 1, which is great, and your opponents not really know what to expect anyway, so this is kind of like a roguish deck, which I like. But Blood Moon is relevant in most of the games you're going to be playing. So yeah, 4 of, it's fine in multiples, don't worry about it. 4 is good, keep 4. This is essentially kind of like a Blue Moon deck without any counter spells. It's a Blue Moon deck with giants. That's how I see it. So yeah, Blood Moon and Aethervile definitely help this deck survive and actually become somewhat viable. I've actually had a decent win percentage with it. So the lands. Let's get to the lands. I'm playing 21 total, I believe. Of course, it's not going to be my Teamer Delver decks where I'm playing 17 lands. So let's get to it. Cascade Bluffs. Yeah, I needed more ways to filter my lands, get the right mana without necessarily paying life. So Cascade Bluffs is a great way to do that. And I'm also playing 4 Spire Bluff Canals. It's a bit much. Not really a fan of it. I might, if I were you, or if I was to revisit this deck, which I probably will in the future, I might cut one and add some other dual land, like maybe another Cascade Bluffs, whatever it may be. But yeah, I think 4 is a tad much, but it was okay. It wasn't the worst thing. And then I have 2 Steam Vents, nothing crazy there. I don't like to go higher than that in terms of shocks. And then of course you have your fetches, 4 Misty of Rainforest and 4 Scalding Tarns. Nothing too weird there, and 4 islands and 1 mountain. Just, if you need to go get a mountain for whatever reason to not hurt yourself too much in terms of, mana, mountain is a good way to do it. But apart from that, you also have 4 islands, which makes sense. The sideboard. Okay, so in the sideboard, I have quite a bit of counter magic, or I should say permission. And that's, mostly for your combo matchups, even your control matchups. These will come in handy. Yeah, that's why they're there. You could be transformational. Maybe you could remove your lightning bolts in place to make room for these. Maybe you could cut some sleight of hands, whatever it may be, or glimpse cosmos, whatever you feel more comfortable. But you can be transformational a bit and become a bit, play a bit more of the control game if necessary. But this is really here not necessarily to control your opponent, but to, again, slow things down a bit so that you can do what you need to do to win out the game. Dragon's Claw to gain life. Well, when you're playing against burn decks, when you're playing against blitz decks or whatever it may be, any kind of aggro deck that's playing red, Dragon's Claw is going to become very important. Keep in mind you are also casting mostly red spells, so this is also relevant for you when you're casting your own spells, because it's whenever a player, not whenever your opponent. So yeah, Dragon's Claw comes in quite handy in a lot of matchups where you might feel overwhelmed. You could add in a few of these and hopefully they'll help you out gain some life and help you last long enough to win. Relic of Progenitus. Yeah, it seems like a decent card to have in terms of graveyard hate. If you feel like you need graveyard hate, Relic of Progenitus would work well in this one. Obviously, you don't want something that kills all the cards in your graveyard, like Gravedigger's Cage, because, well, then you can't cast Glimpse of Cosmos, right? So that's why I'm not running that. I'm running Relic of Progenitus instead. Shatter Spree, I just wanted to play Shatter Spree. It's been a while. I really love that art, and if I need to target multiple artifacts, there are some decks still in the meta that are playing many artifacts. I felt like Shatter Spree is the way to go. Anger of the Gods and Kozilek's Return. I have a split between these two. One Anger, two Kozilek Return. No real reason. Kozilek Return mostly because you want to be able to take out creatures with protection from red, which are kind of rampant at the moment, which is why Kozilek's Return is great, because it's a sweeper, but it's colorless, so it's not red, so you can still take out those creatures. And I'm having one Anger of the Gods split, but you could play 3 Kozilek's Return if you really want, or 3 Anger of the Gods if you're not worried about protection from red. It's really up to you. And the matchups. Alright, well, when it comes to combo, yeah, you're slow. You're slow. If you're playing against Storm or whatever, yeah, that's going to be pretty brutal. Blood Moon's not going to do anything. You have no permission in the main. So, you know, hope they stumble. Or hope you draw the nuts and you could kill them real quick. But, yeah, that's going to be a really tough game 1. Just putting it out there. If you're playing against land combo deck, like Primetime decks, your odds of winning game 1 are much better. First of all, they're not necessarily explosive. They can be kind of slow. You have Lightning Bolt and other removal to kind of kill the creatures that help them ramp up really quickly, which is always good. And you have Blood Moon. So, I mean, one Blood Moon basically shuts them off, especially if they don't have access to green immediately. So that's really important. I found Blood Moon to be really useful in those type of matchups. So keep that in mind. That's really kind of a split. Depends what combo deck you're playing. Aggro decks. Okay. Aggro decks are going to be a bit tough. If you draw into your Lightning Bolts and Bone Crusher Giants early on, you're probably okay if you can survive the initial onslaught, because, you know, the aggro decks are really fast, but they tend to, run out of gas at some point, and if you can catch them at that point and then take over, take back tempo and start beating them down, you beat down much harder than their creatures, and all your creatures are huge, so, once you get a couple of them to stick on the battlefield, you kind of shut down your opponent's attack vectors, because they have really no way to go. Like, they're going to have to really, if they're playing a prowess deck, they really got to pump it up, or they're going to waste some cards just to take out one of your creatures, which is fine. You want that. You want them to waste mana and burn to take out a creature as opposed to taking you out. So once you start getting your big giants to stick, it starts changing really quick for your opponent. That's what I experienced anyway. And then once you start swinging, especially if you're able to, multiply the damage being done with Calamity Bearer, it's essentially game over. Thought not seer decks, big mana decks, so Tron, whatever it may be. Again, you're running Blood Moon in the main. If you're able to cast Blood Moon turn 3, then you probably win. If you can't, it's going to be a tough game 1. It really depends on what variant of Tron they're playing, but if they're playing kind of slow or not necessarily going to go nuts on turn 4, you might have a good chance of dealing enough damage to them to, put them out. But you're going to really rely on Blood Moon quite a bit. And then the sideboard, you might have to side accordingly to deal with big mana decks if you see a lot of them in your meta. Bring in Negates to stop, Karn and other Planeswalkers, whatever you have to do. Bring in, artifact removal as well, because they run quite a few artifacts. That's the type of stuff that's going to show up your win percentages. Not Magic decks. Again, it's kind of like a crapshoot, let's be honest. Now, the big thing here is, again, you have relatively big creatures. So if you're not, drawing poorly and you're able to make your creatures stick early on, I mean, your opponents still kind of have to beat you some way or another. So game 1 might be tough, but you bring in Graveyard Hate game 2 and a few other hate cards, and you might be able to beat decks like Dredge. It might happen. But yeah, it's going to be an uphill battle. Let's just keep it that way. Control decks, or any Stoneblade decks, essentially, because that's basically what most control decks are right now in Modern. You're pretty good. You run a lot of removal, like I said, so you can hopefully kill Stoneforge Mystic, before they can tap it to bring a early Batter Skull. You do have Artifact Hate on the side. You have Blood Moon, which really hurts those decks. Most of them are not resilient to Blood Moon, so if you play it, it's probably gonna shut them down. You'll see a match, I believe, later on today where that happens. So Blood Moon definitely helps you out. And again, once you get your creatures to stick, they're gonna have issues dealing with you big time. So that's a good thing about dealing with control decks with Izzet Giants. And last but not least, mid-range. So mid-range is going to be rough. Again, mid-range, my main concern with mid-range decks is that they run a lot of removal in the main that deals with artifacts. So even in game 1, your Aethervile might be targeted relatively early. You won't be able to use it, which is going to kind of suck. What's great about mid-range decks is that they often foil the Blood Moon, which is great. That's fine by me. A lot of mid-range decks are also running Death's Shadow, so they seem to be fine going down to 9, 8, 7 life. Yeah, good for them. I mean, all you need to do is attack with Tectonic Giant and Calamity Bear on the battlefield and start just dealing, you know, 6 damage to their face. And that's going to be a major problem for them. And on the flip side, you could also block with multiple giants and kill off their Death's Shadow. Because even when you block and you deal damage to Death's Shadow, it's going to be multiplied. So I actually like the mid-range matchups, but it really depends. I mean, if you have the mulligan and they get a lot of disruption, hand disruption early on, it's going to be rough, but that's true for most decks. So I think your mid-range matchup is actually pretty decent if you get enough repetition with the deck and you're comfortable with the deck. I have to say that outright. So yeah, that's Izzet Giants. An actual Izzet Giants deck that probably has the best chance of working of the Giants decks I've seen posted up recently. I'm just going to leave it at that. If you want to see my little rant, 4 or 5 post rant on Twitter, go for it. I posted it last week. But yeah, I had quite a bit of fun. Although, again, I think in recent memory, this is a deck that I went through the most iterations. And by iterations, I don't mean like, oh, I changed a number of a card in the deck. No, I mean like, okay, scrap 80% of it and then restart. So I did that maybe like a dozen times with this deck, going all the way from Teamer to Izzet. And even when I got to Izzet, I didn't have the right formula. And I think this final formula that I presented today works really well, or relatively well, for a Giants deck in a really fast modern meta. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comment section down below of Izzet Giants. I really want to hear from you. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy my content in general, please subscribe, hit the notification bell. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook. I'll share my content on social media. All that stuff really helps me out a lot. Would really appreciate it. If you want to support this channel through Patreon, check out the Patreon link in the description of this video. I've set up Patreon rewards that you get at the end of every year. But all that information is on Patreon. And of course, stay tuned for the 3 matches I'll be posting up today. Thanks, and have a good one.